Josh Mankiewicz, a correspondent for Dateline NBC, the longest-running primetime show in NBC history. He began reporting for the news magazine in February 1995, and since then has contributed a mix of breaking news stories, news analysis, and investigative reports to the broadcast. Josh will come on stage. He'll introduce every other member of the panel, and I can't wait for this discussion. So please join me in welcoming them all to the stage.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, so I'm going to introduce everybody starting right here. This is Derrica Wilson, who is co-founder and CEO of the Black and Missing Foundation. She has more than 2 decades of experience in law enforcement and public safety. She was the first Black female officer with the City of Falls Church, Virginia Police Department. Also one of the first crime prevention specialists in Virginia, and she is also a certified human trafficking investigator. Next to her is Rebecca Howard. Now, the reason I'm here today is because I did a story back in 2005 about how if you watch television in this country, particularly if you watch network television, you would have thought that everybody who was missing was white, blonde, and attractive. And we certainly were only doing that kind of story. It was through that story that I met Rebecca Howard. She is now the chair of the board for the Black and Missing Foundation. She's also a publicist and at the moment a non-practicing attorney, although you could probably get her to represent you if you needed her to. It was the disappearance of her niece, Tamika Houston, that originally sort of put us in the same room, and it's the reason that we're in contact all these years later. Since Tamika's disappearance and, as we learned later, subsequent murder, she's dedicated her life to ensuring other families don't have to endure the same sort of pain and uncertainty that she experienced. Rebecca is also the co-producer of the original audio series called Finding Tamika, which is on Amazon Audible, which is available, I think, wherever you get your podcasts. And that is the story of her really tireless efforts to find out what happened to her niece and to sort of understand why it was that we were covering Natalie Holloway 6, 7, 8 times on Dateline, and we weren't covering Tamika Houston at all. Next to Rebecca is Natalie Wilson. Natalie is co-founder, chief operating officer of the Black and Missing Foundation. She has 2 decades of experience in public affairs and media relations. She knows the power, the reach of the press. She's the one that's always on the phone to me all the time. And she has a proven record of getting top-tier media coverage and partnerships with local, state, and international platforms. And finally, an actual reporter. Jonathan Franklin's a reporter for National Public Radio, where he covers race and its intersection with culture, identity, and justice. He's been reporting and covering a broad spectrum of local and national news in the nation's capital, across the U.S. His reporting can be seen and heard across NPR's digital, social, and audio platforms, All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Here and Now, NPR News Now. Before NPR, he was a multimedia journalist at the WUSA, the CBS station in Washington, D.C. Before we start, we're going to take a look at a brief video which will give you some idea of what it is that we're talking about, although I'm thinking most of you probably already know.
There's so many missing people of color in the U.S. African Americans remain missing 4 times longer than white Americans.
That number is alarming.
For these families, it's difficult watching the news and seeing people like Gabby being covered when they say people who look like them will never get this coverage.
But Young tells me in the past 3 decades, news coverage of his mother's case hasn't gone beyond less than a handful of stories.
What about my mom? You know, she was somebody too.
My sister went missing in 2009, but all the major news stations, nobody would talk to me.
Gwen Ifill coined the term missing white woman syndrome.
If you don't meet those criteria, blonde hair, blue eyes, your stories are not newsworthy.
Here's my niece, she's missing. Her story is just as compelling.
A study analyzing news coverage found that while Black people make up nearly 40% of all missing persons cases, white women were overrepresented, receiving more than half of the national news coverage, even though they make up less than a third of all missing persons cases.
How Native Americans are feeling right now.
We have been shouting from the rooftops about our women for years, and no one is listening.
We have been sounding the alarm that people of color are disappearing at an alarming rate.
And the implications of this are literally life and death. The amount of media coverage you get immediately after you go missing has a direct result on what happens to your case.
Also, when there's all this media attention, that puts pressure on law enforcement. That directs resources to these searches. It increases reward money.
The family isn't getting any help from the police or the local media.
He's a father of 5. He's loved by his family and his people, just the same as anybody else in this country.
The documented disparity is what inspired the Columbia Journalism Review to launch AreYouPressworthy.com.
It says I'm worth 67 news stories.
That's a lot.
You are worth 8 news stories is what I'm saying.
What we're finding as we're speaking to individuals or reporters at news stations, there are no policies in place to determine who gets coverage.
Daniel's father, David, says that when it came to his son, a Black man, it was extremely difficult to get any sort of media attention about his disappearance.
Someone knows something out there, and we need that someone to come forward to help us end this nightmare for these families.
And it's changing that narrative and ensuring that our missing are household names too.
One of the things that became clear to me in 2005 when I was first working on this, which I really pitched to Dateline mostly because I was irritated at the number of stories we were doing about sort of identical victims. In the same way that there's sort of 2 economic Americas and there's 2 justice system Americas, there's 2 journalism Americas, and that was abundantly clear back then. We were trying to cover every missing white woman, but we weren't covering really anybody else. Most of the missing people in the FBI's database of missing persons are men, and a huge percentage are people of color, much larger than the population at large. And so it's sort of from that I got interested in this. And Natalie and Derrica, you started the Black and Missing Foundation about 15 years ago. Tell me what you saw happening then, and the extent to which things have changed, if they have.
Okay, thank you, Josh, for that question. When we started the organization 15 years ago, I'll be honest, it was bad. People of color were disappearing at an alarming rate. 30% of the population for missing people were people of color. And they were not getting that media coverage. And media coverage is vital, as indicated in the piece, because it puts pressure on law enforcement to add resources to the case, but it also alerts the community that someone is missing and you can search for them, or the community can be more involved. We have been fighting an uphill battle. It has gotten better, but there are, we are being shunned by the media too. We are met with silence when we reach out to media outlets for coverage. We want our missing to be household names too, and I'll ask you a question to name a person of color who has garnered around-the-clock media coverage, national media coverage, besides Carly Russell. You can't, because it doesn't happen. And that's what we're trying to change, because these are our mothers, our fathers, our children that are disappearing at an alarming rate, and we need to bring them home or to provide much needed answers for their families.
And just to add on to what Natalie stated, Tamika Houston's case is the inspiration behind the birth of the Black and Missing Foundation. Tamika went missing from my hometown of Spartanburg, South Carolina. And Tamika looked like my sister. She looked like my daughter. She looked like my nieces. And if it was one of my family members, I would want the same resources dedicated in finding my loved one. And so that's why Natalie and I, we channel our professions. Me being in law enforcement and Natalie in media and public relations, those are the two critical professions needed in finding and bringing our missing home. And that is why we are here today to continue this fight. We want to make it very clear that missing persons isn't a Black issue or a white issue. It is a human issue. It is an American issue that is happening right now today.
You know, and it's, I want to just underline what Natalie said. This is not just an issue of fairness, although it is an issue of fairness, but it's also, we see at Dateline all the time, families that bang on the door of law enforcement get more attention. Doesn't always mean the case is going to be solved, but they tend to get more attention. That's true of missing people as well, and in that case, the attention that you end up giving these stories can be a real call to action, because sometimes it can produce something that will make a huge break in the case. So it's vitally important, not just fairness. Rebecca, if you would, just give the audience a little bit of an idea of what it was like when you were trying to attract any kind of attention for Tamika's story back in 2004, 2005.
Okay. Yeah, so I have kind of a unique perspective, and so my niece Tamika goes missing in May of 2004. And immediately I jumped into action. I was a publicist, that's what I did for a living. So at the time, you take us back to the early 2000s and remember the cases of Chandra Levy, what's like 2002, 2003, Lacey Peterson. So all of us are used to, conditioned to seeing those stories, and they're certainly sad. You felt terrible for the families. And when my niece went missing, as a publicist, I thought, well, certainly, I have the skills, the resources, the contacts. I know how to pitch a story. I know who to call. I know how to do it. You know, abundance of people to reach out to, and I was met with silence, and I was stunned. And this was months. So Tamika was missing for 15 months before we had a resolution in the case.
This was at a time when you could not turn on one of the magazine shows or morning shows and not see this coverage.
Without question, you couldn't. And I think what really set me off was it was Lori Hacking out of Utah. There was a young mother. Terrible story. You know, it turned out her husband had killed her, but she went missing. I think she was missing for 33 days. And this story was round the clock. You were hearing constant updates. And I knew at that time that every single producer that was putting this on air, every reporter had to have already heard from me. I was emailing. We were still faxing back then, emailing, calling, you know, the assignment desk. And I was like, what is it about Tamika that makes her less compelling, less deserving? Why is there less empathy for my situation, Tamika's situation, my sister, Tamika's mother? Why is there less empathy? Why is no one listening to me? And it was at that point where I was angry, frankly, I was angry. And, oh, this is not working? Okay. I was angry at that point, and I almost changed my pitch. And I'm you know, when I'm reaching out to people, listen, you know, you see the stories. Please tell me what it is about Tamika that makes her story less important. And eventually I kind of broke through that, you know, I don't even know how exactly it landed on your desk, Tamika's story. I mean, honestly, I don't even think we knew.
Yeah, I don't even know.
Eventually, yeah.
I was looking for that story at exactly the time that you were agitating.
Yeah.
I mean, it's more luck than anything else.
Right, so it was done about a year into Tamika's case, but beyond the examination, eventually by the time Tamika started to get national attention, we kind of knew where the investigation was going. So when we talk about a cascading effect, how not only does media attention help you perhaps get tips from the public to, you know, in order to have maybe a resolution to the case, but it also, the police investigators, once Dateline NBC is calling them, once ABC News is calling them, they're it means something, you know what I mean? And especially when you're dealing with small departments, they're certainly, their caseloads are very big, but they want to have answers. They want to have answers. Then eventually, not only that, but in the prosecution of the man who killed my niece, I don't know if you all remember Trey Gowdy, Congressman Trey Gowdy, who's since left Congress, but at the time, he was very ambitious. He was a solicitor in the Seventh Circuit in South Carolina. Because of the attention that it got, he jumps onto that case. You know, as a solicitor, you usually have an assistant take care of something like this, but he jumps into the case and takes it over. And then, you know, I knew the full resources of his, you know, the prosecution at that point. In order to get a resolution for this case, I felt very confident that this isn't something that would just be pled down. You know, he wanted to go to trial, he was prepared, and at the last moment, the person who killed my niece actually pled out, but was still sentenced again to life in prison without the chance of parole by a judge who also, at this point, the spotlight was on Spartanburg, South Carolina, and it made a difference. It made a difference, and I just did not want any other families to go through what we went through. And that's pretty much, that's my story.
You know, I did that story in 2005, and I mean, the thing about, you know, like not everything you do is going to be Watergate, you know. I mean, I was not under any illusions that we were changing the world with that story. Although all these years later, it's probably one of the one or two stories at Dateline I'm proudest of, because internally it did make a difference. We didn't start suddenly covering people of color, but we did stop doing only those other kind of stories, and we probably did fewer missing persons cases overall. But we also sort of, you know, in a sort of more standard Dateline fare of murders, we definitely opened that up to covering other stories and other populations, and it probably did make a difference internally. I worked in 3 different local newsrooms in Washington, D.C., New York City, and Los Angeles. So, Jonathan, let me ask you, what's the pushback in a newsroom when you say to your bosses, I want to do a story about Tamika Houston, who's missing, and this is a story that doesn't really have an end to it. We don't know what happened. But I got her family, and I can talk to the cops, and we can do some other stuff. You know, what do your managers say?
Well, I would say more in like national news, it's more so like, so what's the national peg? Like, is it, you know, timeliness? Is it, you know, did she go missing, you know, 5 days ago? Did she go missing 10 years ago? But when I was working in local news, it was oftentimes we met with the pushback of, okay, this is a person of color. Oftentimes they would be classified as a runaway. So it's like, okay, well, she's been missing for, you know, 5 weeks, but she keeps running away. But there's a story there. And so being able to sort of advocate for missing people of color is oftentimes, that's the pushback. And so, you know, whether it's an A blog story, whether it's a B blog story, whether you're trying to, you know, fight with, you know, news managers to be like, hey, like, I think this is a good story. You know, I have the police report, I have all the facts, I have all the information, but oftentimes it's more so like they're classified as a runaway or they're classified as some other category that's not being met as, you know, oh, well, somebody kidnapped her, somebody abducted her. And so having those sort of conversations with management in local newsrooms is what really, I think, would be the pushback in a sense, because they oftentimes don't see the timeliness or why this is important for reporters to chase a story.
One of the things, you know, that we've seen and that I've seen talked about more in journalism lately, which is a good thing, is the sort of automatic acceptance, particularly in local newsrooms, of the police side of the story. We certainly learned that as regards to officer-involved shootings, that's not necessarily the only story that's out there and that you need to ask other questions. But that's true of missing person cases too. I mean, you know, one of the things that I've encountered doing missing person cases on our series on podcast series on Dateline is that the family's perception of what the story is and what's going on is frequently quite different from the one the police are telling you, and you're going to want to talk to both.
Right, and I remember my first day actually at NPR, was the day when like all the stuff started bubbling around with Gabby Petito. And I remember in our editorial meeting, we were discussing, okay, well, what angles we're going to cover. You know, we have a correspondent that's based out in Arizona. We, you know, want to do this, you know, big exclusive coverage. And I remember raising my hand in an editorial meeting. I said, well, there are 5 other missing people of color, 2 of them which are Black men, Jelani Day and Daniel Robinson. They're also missing around the same time that Gabby went missing. What are we doing to amplify the coverage for these missing Black men and Black women? Literally was met with silence. Like nobody like literally was talking about it. I think actually one of the Black editorial managers was like, ooh, like, you know, kind of, you know, was stunned when I actually like, brought this up on our first day. But just seeing the implicit bias that national newsrooms and even local newsrooms place on attractive, younger, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white women in comparison to missing Black and brown indigenous people. So we kind of see that. I really was exposed to it working in local newsrooms, but really didn't see it until I got to NPR. And literally my first day was like, well, what are we going to do about these missing Black men? And oftentimes, and especially being a reporter of color, it oftentimes falls on you to tell the story. Even though I think as a journalist, we have the responsibility, we all have the responsibility to tell the stories, but it shouldn't fall on reporters of color to tell the stories about missing people of color.
Let's talk a little bit about something you said about implicit bias. Natalie.
You know, Josh, sadly, we see that race, gender, economic status, your zip code is a bias to media coverage and law enforcement resources when you go missing or when someone is reported missing. And there are stereotypes that the person that is missing is poor, they're from a marginalized community, and no one cares. But again, we should care as a nation, and as Derrica said, this is a human rights issue. So what we're doing as an organization is we are providing scholarships and fellowships to raise up the next generation of journalists to tell our stories and to make sure that our missing are, again, household names too. And I do want to add that we don't expect every story to be covered, right? That's being very naive. But let's be fair. Stop reporting on one case all the time and show some of these other cases because these individuals deserve to come home. They're not thugs. They're not criminals. And also be mindful of the images that you show when you are featuring a missing person. You know, you have a few seconds to make that connection with the audience. And if you show a picture that's not in a good light that you received or got from Facebook, people are not going to care. They're not going to want to find that missing individuals because, again, that perception is they're getting what they deserve. And it's so unfair to the missing person.
One of the things that families hear from law enforcement, particularly when the missing person is, I'm going to say 18 years old or older, is, and it's a woman, well, you know, she's run off, she's with some guy. Which is, like, I don't think anybody said that to Gabby Petito's family. But that's something you hear all the time. And the other thing is, you know, well, they're old enough, they don't need to be in contact with you if they don't want to. And the same ethos that says that we need to listen to women who are talking about sexual assault, we need to listen to and believe moms, for example, when they say things like, no, you don't understand. I realize it hasn't been 48 hours yet, but she would not be out of touch like this. She wouldn't have left all her stuff behind. When Tamika disappeared, did you hear things like that from law enforcement? Like, you know, well, she's probably got a boyfriend.
Yeah, absolutely. I basically sat in the office in Spartanburg, the Spartanburg Public Safety Department, and I would not leave until actually, because I had already reached out to the local media in that market, and I put together a missing poster, and I wanted to get attention from the local market, because obviously I felt that was the first step. And I was getting pushback from the reporters who I was reaching out to, producers who I was reaching out to, saying that they needed to hear from the Spartanburg Public Safety Department. They needed a release from them to confirm there's an active police investigation, which is certainly reasonable. So,
But the idea that like this is not a story unless the police say
at least the police say it's a story.
is the wrong way to approach this.
Right, but so immediately I go into action. I literally sit there and would not leave until I spoke to the public information officer and said, listen, this, my niece has been missing X amount of time. I can't even get the news to tell her story locally without it coming from you. And I sat there, and he's a good, like Josh, he's a good friend of mine today, Lieutenant Steve Lamb. I guess he's a major now, and he says it was my insistence, finally it's like, this lady is not gonna leave, you have to talk to her, and you really need to do this release, and he did it, and we started to get tips. Within 24 hours, we found her car, which was kind of like, led to the first part of that investigation. So it is certainly, it's very frustrating, and why Black and Missing is so important, because you really need to advocate for yourself as a family member if someone's missing, and sometimes you just don't have the strength to do it. I was really I love my niece dearly, but my sister, Tamika's mother, was a complete mess, could not do anything. So you need someone to be able to kind of put the emotions aside and advocate, and that's why Black and Missing is so important, because they do that on behalf of families, and it's such critical work.
Derrica, tell me what sort of effect it has on law enforcement when a case is spotlighted, either locally or nationally, but probably locally first.
Well, no police department want to be embarrassed, and that is why the media coverage is so vital, so critical. Law enforcement, they are so quick to label people of color as runaways. They're also telling families to wait 24 to 48 hours, when we all know the first 24 to 48 hours are the most critical moments. And I think for everyone that's in this room, it's so important to understand the power of your voice. And so when law enforcement, they're saying this child is a runaway, let me ask each and every one of you in here, is a runaway a missing person? Yes. Is a runaway an endangered person? When you give law enforcement that pushback, you can create the narrative yourself. This is an endangered child that is out there. No one knows where that child is. And when you keep hammering onto them, they're going to dedicate more resources to those cases. We see so many uphill battles with the cases that we're working. They're saying these children are running away. They're being victims of human trafficking. We're having more sad news updates, more now than ever, because they're not dedicating the time and resource. And one case that I'm thinking of in particular, Natalie can chime in, is where we had this mother. She went to law enforcement and she said, my child is missing. And law enforcement said, wait about 4 days. She's probably laid up with some man. Mm-hmm. And she was abducted at a gas station by masked men, and she was repeatedly raped. Mm-hmm. She has been found, thank goodness, but think about the trauma. Think about what she has experienced, what she's going through right now, because the person, when we do find them, that's the easy part. The aftermath. People don't think about what they've experienced while they were out there. The PTSD, the suicidal thoughts, and everything of that sort. So that's why we are challenging our lawmakers to help change the laws and how law enforcement handle the cases. There are no two jurisdictions alike. You go to this jurisdiction, they tell you, we'll take the police report immediately. The neighboring jurisdiction tells the families to wait 24 to 48 hours. There's also no accountability in putting these cases into NCIC. Some have requirements within 2 hours. Some decide that they don't want to because it's at their discretion. And that's why we need holistic policies across the country, how law enforcement will respond. Because as Natalie mentioned, race, gender, and zip code should not be a barrier to getting law enforcement resources, which ultimately leads to media coverage.
And this is points of something we were talking about before, which is that, the law enforcement story, which is that she's a runaway. That might be true, that might not be true. I mean, I'm working on a trafficking story in Dallas right now in which girl disappeared from a Mavericks game and was widely thought to be a runaway, and they were looking at her as if looking for her as if she were a runaway, and it turned out she wasn't. She was in fact imprisoned somewhere. And the other thing is that 24 to 48 hour waiting period, that's from like 100 years ago. It takes 1 minute to put out an alert on social media. That 24 to 48 hour waiting period involved the effort of getting the sort of cumbersome law enforcement machinery started to look for somebody, printing out flyers and going out and talking to people, and, putting together a televised appeal. I mean, there is no reason to wait 24 to 48 hours anymore. Jonathan, one of the things that I certainly recognized when I was in local newsrooms, which was a long time ago, was that there wasn't a whole lot of debate. We didn't spend a lot of time agonizing over the ethical implications because we had an hour and a half of early news to fill. Like, stop telling me we need to do this story or that story. We need a story. It needs to be a minute and 40 long, and you need to go do it now. That's as big a problem now as it was then, probably more so because local newsrooms are smaller.
Right, I would say more as newsrooms are shifting to more, and it depends on the market size as well, they're shifting to more of like a 24-hour news cycle, and you have like 3 or 4 channels, and you need like time to fill things. So I would say that's not as a problem now, but I would say more so when you're getting in those spaces to make those, editorial decisions, having people that look like us in the editorial room, I feel like is more of the issue. Like, there are not enough, I would say, black and brown or diverse managers to make the sort of editorial decision to say, hey, like, Jonathan pitched this story about, Tamika Houston, and, we have all the facts, we have all the evidence, and we talk to, Spartanburg PD, I think we should run it. And so having more of a, diverse newsroom and having people to, and especially within different markets. I remember working in Baltimore, and Baltimore is a, very diverse place, has a, interesting vibe, but it's just a very diverse place. But having people that look like the demographic in your newsroom really helps. So having people to advocate for those stories, advocate to, not even just missing persons, but even, stories for the community that are for the community and that are about the community, and not really telling the stories of like, oh, well, here's crime is up, homicides are, 83%, here's what, residents are complaining about, but telling those stories and for the community and impactful stories really helps news coverage, but also, like I said, having that sort of diversity in your management will really help amplify coverage across the board, period.
Rebecca, what should families do to sort of engage, not just with law enforcement, but with newsrooms? Because frequently, as you talked about, like coverage ends up spurring law enforcement. Like, if you can get law enforcement engaged, if you can get a newsroom engaged, law enforcement becomes engaged as a result of it, because as Derrica said, people don't like to be embarrassed.
Yeah, 100%. They go hand in hand. It's really when you have a missing loved one, it's really a 3-pronged approach. It should be, it's the outreach to news, so public relations, media relations outreach. You're developing a relationship, a healthy relationship with law enforcement, which is difficult to do when both parties are under a lot of stress. But and the third is community involvement and getting the community behind you. So all of those 3 things work hand in hand, and that's what Black and Missing does, tackles those 3 components. In terms of families engaging with the media, it's persistence. I mean, that's all I think in my case, persistence, being able to not be angry with the people, trying to teach families don't let your frustration and the lack of coverage deter you. Just you have to keep kind of plugging away. Eventually you come across, eventually it landed on his radar. I did enough pitching, started getting enough smaller stories, and eventually someone is going to listen. And sometimes from your perspective as reporters, as news people, if you could be that voice, if something comes across, step back for a minute, think, you know, you may not naturally, you know, feel a connection, whatever, but all of you have the power to kind of advance these stories when they come across your desk and be, you know, just what a family needs to get some help.
Now, you're working on a series of sort of policies and procedures and guidelines to sort of help newsrooms, you know, I don't know, even the playing field. Tell me about some of that.
Sure. So Derrick and I have been speaking to journalists across the country in many newsrooms, and what we're realizing is there are no policies or procedures in place to determine who gets coverage. So Jonathan calls, I call about our missing family member. There's an assignment editor, answers the phone, sees the email, that person makes the decision. So what we are doing as an organization is putting together a task force, and we would love to include you all to be part of that task force to create and implement policies and procedures across the country when it comes to missing persons. Like, how do we tackle this problem? Because again, we want to have fair and unbiased media coverage so that we can bring more people home. And Josh, we're also providing media training to families. We know that it's a very difficult time. We're meeting these families at the worst point in their lives. So as an organization, we're training families how to work with the media. And sad to say, you know, when I coach families, especially Black mothers, I have to tell them, don't come across as an angry Black woman. Because your child is missing, you have to be contained, and it's so disheartening that I have to tell someone that you should be able to show your emotion. So there are so many moving parts to all of this when we peel back the layers.
Can you give an example of a case in which coverage made a big difference?
Made a difference? Oh, yes. There was a young lady missing out of New York. I believe she was missing for 6 months. And we were able to be guests on The View. And within 14 minutes of that segment airing, that child was found. And that's the power of the media. That's why you all are powerful in helping these families. It's bigger than Derrica and I. It's bigger than everyone, except for Jonathan on the stage, because he has that power too, and Josh. But you all can help us. That's what we need. We cannot do this work alone, and we need to amplify these stories, because again, these families deserve answers. You may walk by someone that's missing and recognize them because of a story that was done. We have seen that as well. There were 2 young girls in Maryland who were missing, and because we have a relationship with the local NBC station, called the editor, the assignment desk editor, and she got them coverage, and the other news stations started to pick the story up. And a Good Samaritan and law enforcement found these girls within hours. So again, there's power in media coverage.
And if I could just add to what Natalie stated about that story from The View, law enforcement labeled her as a runaway, and she was in fact a victim. And just to add to that context, the anonymous tipster contacted us and not law enforcement, because it's so important for people to understand that there's a lack of trust when it comes to the community and law enforcement. And as Jonathan mentioned, we look like the community that we're serving. We don't care who you are. We want the information that you have that can possibly end the nightmare. So when that anonymous tipster contacted us, the first thing they said is, please do not share any information, but I know what this child is, because that individual was in fear for their safety as well.
Anybody have any questions? We've got about 15 minutes to go. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Grace Gorda with Local 3 News in Chattanooga, Tennessee. What advice do you have for a white reporter like me navigating racial issues and caring, but also maybe not having the best understanding with that racial difference?
You want to take that?
Okay, well, I guess I'll take it. And I tell my white colleagues this all the time when I was working local, when I'm working at NPR. As a white person, you have more privilege than myself as a black reporter to amplify these stories in newsrooms. And that's just, just the facts, period. Like, I would say, if I try to pitch a story, oftentimes we get pushback saying, oh, well, I don't think that's a story. But then I would, give that same pitch to a white colleague and, that's a great thing. I'm like, I literally just pitched this like 5 minutes ago and y'all gonna say that this is not a good story. But that's another story for another day. But I would say, navigating those spaces, I would say use empathy, like being able to, be empathetic, but also using your journalistic ability to ask the questions, go beyond, just a press release version of what law enforcement says. We get the press releases and, we talked about this yesterday in our session about how, the original press release of George Floyd's murder was depicted as a complete 180 of what actually happened. So kind of doing the homework of saying, okay, well, this doesn't look right, and asking the questions, following up with law enforcement. I would say maybe 10 law enforcement agencies that I was doing stories about missing persons cases, they're like, there's that Jonathan Franklin again, call on my phone. But like, I had legit questions about what was wrong with this story. So I would say use and navigate the spaces with empathy and not just trying to make the A-block story or to get the Emmy Award or Murrah award-winning report for it, but actually talking to the families, being empathetic, when talking to the families and getting pictures. First thing I do is like, well, what picture do you want me to use? Because there are pictures online. You can go to Facebook, you can go to Instagram, TikTok. I'm like, what picture do you want me to use to depict your missing loved one? So being able to ask those questions and navigating the spaces with empathy and not just doing the story just to turn it out.
And I have one thing I would like to add as well. Understanding the power of your platform, social media. As Natalie mentioned, we understand that not every case is going to make the 5 and 10 o'clock news cycle. It's not going to make mainstream media. But when you show the diversity in sharing profiles, so following your local police departments and sharing those flyers, you have your own following. There are community members that love your reporting, and being able to show a vast range of diversity in what you're covering, that builds in those families' trust too.
I also want to add, Derrica and Jonathan mentioned empathy and trust. When we are connecting with families, they become our family members as well. And what we're hearing from them is that many times a reporter would reach out and they're excited, yes, I'm going to get coverage, then the reporter ghosts them. And they are heartbroken. So please do your homework first before you contact a family, promising them that you will provide media coverage, and it doesn't happen. It's like they're victimized all over again. And again, show some empathy and sympathy to, what they're going through, because it's really tough. Families are being scammed many times out of their life savings because people can promise to bring their loved one home, and you just don't understand what they're going through. So just show some compassion and some love when you are, speaking to families.
Chris Welty, Fox 8 here in New Orleans. In one of my first markets, we had a missing persons case. Family got lots of coverage, but at one point, they started to cut off communication with us because the police department was giving us information. We were reporting that information, but the family felt like, that information should come from us. It shouldn't come from the police department. And the person was still missing at the time. How do you keep that line of communication open when the family wants to be the point of contact, but you have to report the fact that, well, they found your loved one's missing bike, in that case? It just seemed like there was a disconnect at some point. And then from that point, the relationship was really fractured between the family and every media outlet within our community.
Well, that's a great question. One of the challenges is that we hear from the families, law enforcement, they're following up with the media, and the media is helping to shape the narrative of the story, yet they're failing to follow up with the family. So the worst thing is for the family to turn on the news or pick up a paper and read an update on their missing loved one when the detective has failed to contact the family. I understand from an investigative standpoint with law enforcement that they oftentimes keep things close to the vest because they don't want to jeopardize the integrity of an investigation. So by putting their information out, let's say, for example, the bike, it may jog someone's memory. Someone may have seen that bike and they need the public, but at the end of the day, that detective should have contacted the family. And sadly, you all are a casualty due to the lack of empathy and the lack of respect that that agency is showing for the family.
And it's about building that relationship with the family too. You can reach out and say, I've been contacted by law enforcement. There may be a new tip in this case. Would you like to provide a comment? So again, it's alerting that family before you go live on air to talk about a break in the case, giving them that courtesy.
I was just going to ask that, I know in my former TV station, the standing rule was management required if a family reached out and said, hey, our loved one is missing, we had to confirm it with police. If police did not confirm it, we couldn't go with it. Is there any way when you guys send something out, maybe attach a release from police, or maybe have already done that part of the homework? And maybe that makes it a little easier for a newsroom. And
That's a nutty rule, by the way.
It is a nutty rule, I agree.
I think with the power of your reach and your position, I challenge everyone to go back to your respective jurisdictions and ask law enforcement for their missing person policy. Number one, I can guarantee you that some agencies don't even have a policy. And if they have a policy, they're not following it. For example, there's one police department that reached out to us for us to review their missing person policy. Their police report lists the classification runaway, but in their standard operating procedures, runaway is not even the classification. So understanding that their policy and procedures, their policy and the way they are performing sometimes don't match. And then what is the requirement of notifying you all? There should be that communication, that pipeline. So when I served on the force, every single day, someone from that media outlet would contact our PIO. Has anyone been reported missing? Has there been any crimes going on today? And that person in our agency, that PIO, will relay that information to the media outlet. So again, it's about relationship building as well. Checking in every day, having someone, whether it's an intern or administrative stuff, hey, any cases today that we need to highlight. But asking them, do you require families to wait 24 hours? How long does it take for you to create a flyer and begin circulating? It can be as easy as even sending you all the link and sharing it so you all can help get the ball rolling. But remember, law enforcement, they are the gatekeepers. Before you all can even share the story, they have to do their due diligence and take a report first. So hold them accountable and ask those tough questions.
And also on our flyers, we do list the law enforcement agency. So we have information that's available on our website about the case, and again, including law enforcement, that you all can reach out to verify the case.
And if I can just add to what Natalie stated, if you all are sharing or covering any case with the Black and Missing Foundation, we have already done our due diligence to verify that there is a case on file, because we want to make sure the information that we are putting out is accurate.
Shannon Sims from Milwaukee, Wisconsin at WTMJ. I agree wholeheartedly with you about diversity, awareness, and empathy needed in the newsroom, but can you touch again on implicit bias, especially for the news directors in the room, on how important implicit bias plays a role in our daily coverage of missing? Because I know in Milwaukee, as you said, runaway is usually the key word that they're not important from police. And from our management style, it is they had to be reported to the police, they had to be endangered, but we never knew what the criteria was for endangered missing. And many times Black children were never considered endangered. So the implicit bias from not only police departments plays a role in then the implicit bias that comes into our newsrooms, but from a management perspective, can you speak on how important implicit bias really plays a role in the decision making from the top up?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, and we actually had a conversation about this at my last job and also at NPR about missing white women syndrome. I think after the story I did about racial bias and missing persons coverage that went viral, and they were like, oh, well, it's doing numbers online, it's doing well, but we need to have an internal conversation on how we report the news. So I feel like I kind of did, unmasked everything that was going on. I was like, oops, didn't mean to do that, but kind of sort of did kind of mean to do that. But I would say like that's a difficult conversation that newsrooms are needing to have. Just thinking back on that conversation as a whole, we were saying, okay, well, not only this implicit bias is shown within our missing persons cases, but just across the board in general. I remember distinctly, I was doing the case about Shakimia Pate, and we were, we were trying to decide on which platform we would air on. It was like Morning Edition, All Things Considered, Here and Now, and I think like, so they were okay, well, you can get like 3 minutes and 45 seconds. And I was like, well, I need at least like 4 minutes to tell this story, maybe like 5 minutes max. And they were like, well, no, well, like this is gonna be a D-block story. And I'm like, it's a D-block, this is a 25-year missing person case. It needs to have at least a little bit more time. And they're like, okay, well, let's circle back and if there are any new developments, we can put it on the board. And I was like, well, you just gave this correspondent 7 minutes to talk about, let's just say, underwater basket weaving for one point, but this is a hard news story that, needs attention. So that was a conversation that we had to have about like just implicit media bias just in general, about cases in general, just about like story coverage, and it's taking a look back on how things have, oh, this is how it's always been done, but having to shift the narrative, especially as we're going into an election year, we have to shift the narrative in terms of like racial bias, implicit bias, just about, voters or, younger voters, et cetera. So just being able to have those, I would say tough conversations is a start, but also holding your management accountable. I know there's some news directors in the room that are like, oh gosh, we have to, have this conversation, but this is a conversation that needs to be had, especially in markets where you are in a diverse area, like such as Milwaukee, such as New Orleans, such as, Baton Rouge, et cetera. There's a diversity of, individuals that are going missing, but we need to have that conversation about how we cover it, things that take into account, even if law enforcement did not send out a, flyer, I would contact them saying, hey, my name is Jonathan Franklin. I'm with, the local CBS affiliate. We got this tip from a family that says, that their loved one is missing, but they said you failed to send something out. Can you just, I like to use the phrase, just walk me through your process or help me understand what is going on. And so that, nobody likes to get embarrassed. Right. So being able to hold them accountable. And I think one time with the same story with Shakimia Pate, the law enforcement agency failed to give us a statement. So I said, well, I'm going to go live on there on All Things Considered at 4 p.m. And if you don't give me a statement, that's going to look bad on you for our national audience. And they were able to send something up. Okay, well, Mr. Franklin, well, we can send you a Zoom link in 5 minutes and it can be great. But I'm like, well, where was this coverage? Where was all this energy when I asked for 5 minutes ago? So just holding management accountable in order to move forward and shift the narrative of implicit racial bias.
Yeah, and also, I think you don't want to have that conversation on every story. You don't want to be battling with your managing editor like every day on every story, which is why it's much better to, agitate, maybe not for this particular story, but for some broader set of guidelines as to like what we're going to cover, like how we're going to do it, what tack we're going to take generally, how we're ignoring certain kinds of stories, and we need to make sure we don't.
And that's why, Josh, Jonathan, they're so important. I mean, every time I text these two, which is very early in the morning, they respond. And they help us. And maybe if they have a contact in a local area, they put us in contact with the reporter. So again, it's building those relationships and having diversity in the newsrooms and having champions for the work that we do. Can't stress it enough. We cannot do this work alone. And I hope that you know about Janiyah Walker, who's missing out of Milwaukee. And her mother, is desperately searching for her. And, cover her story. She's somewhere. She could be here in New Orleans. We don't know.
That's your next story. pitching you stories.
And to Natalie's point, because I was going to bring that up, asking the police department, because when you were saying that you don't know, like, the breakdown and the criteria, one thing with Janiyah Walker's case is that they didn't see her as a child. The police department actually said that. She's 16. They said that they would cover up to, the age range is 11. They see as a child. They said, she's not a child, she's a teen. A teen is a child. And this was the pushback that law enforcement was giving the family. That designation with the police department and their rules only meant that they would assign that case to a sensitive crime division, number one, and number two, they would alert the media of her disappearance. The police failed that family for 6 months before they changed the designation of her classification. And she is still missing to this day.
Probably time for one more.
Hi, Emily Goodell with Apple Valley News in Yakima, Washington. I just want to say thank you so much for what you guys do. This is an issue that's personally really close to me. I cover a lot of missing and murdered Indigenous women and people cases in Washington State because all the land is Yakima Nation land, but the reservation makes up more than half the land in the county, and we have the highest missing persons rate of the entire state for Indigenous people. And one of the problems that I run into is a lack of information from law enforcement because there's retrocession, jurisdictional issues, and tribal police absolutely just will not talk. And I wanted to bring it back to the case number issue because one of the reasons we ask for a case number is because there's also a really high rate of domestic violence, and they've had it happen before where a partner will say that their loved one is missing because they're trying to find them and they're on the run. And so I'm wondering, are there any alternative ways for people who aren't, or if you can't get a police report, are there alternative ways to verify that a person is missing and make sure it's not one of those cases where it's someone just trying to find someone that doesn't want to be found?
That's a great question, and thank you for what you do in covering those cases. Sadly, with our organization, that is the only verification. And so when we have families that are struggling to even get law enforcement, we utilize our power, our relationship, our experience and influence to help families get that covered or get that case number. The reason why it's important for us to make sure a case number is in place, number one, when Natalie and our communications team is pitching it to the media, they know it's been verified. But number two, tips. If we start getting tips in, we need to be able to partner with jurisdictions, whether it's on a local or federal level, to get their involvement. And it has to all tie back. That case number is so critical because it is it's the gatekeeper of all the information that's stored behind it. So it really isn't a way to get around that case, and that's one of the reasons why we verify. We understand all too well that missing persons and domestic violence, there's a correlation. And there are some people that are actually trying to, locate their loved one because of whatever ill will they may have. But that is how we protect our organization as well. And that's how we partner with local law enforcement to try to get the information when those tips are coming in so we can give it back to them so they can do their due diligence and follow up.
I think we're out of time. They're nodding. Thank you all.
Thank you.